Okay, hey, that was pretty quick. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks for coming out. We're so glad you're here. My name is Dave Allen. I'm one of the co-presidents of Allied Arts, one of the co-sponsors. Just a quick agenda check. The co-sponsors are going to say a few remarks at the beginning, and then we'll hand it over to the panelists that you've really come here to see. Again, I'm David Allen with Allied Arts. A little bit about Allied Arts, if you're not familiar. We are a decades-old civic organization in Seattle, and we are all about a great Seattle with wonderful, vibrant public spaces and a vibrant arts community. And we like to think big ideas and ask, what if? So some examples of that is over the years, when they were going to rip down Pike Place Market, Allied Arts said, wait a minute, what if we preserved it? When the wrecking ball was going to come down through Pioneer Square, we said, no, let's preserve Pioneer Square. And my favorite story from Allied Arts is when the viaduct got undermined by the earthquake and had to come down. The default plan by the state was to replace it and build another viaduct, which would have been even bigger by today's standards. And Allied Arts said to the state, hey, wait a minute, what if we didn't have a viaduct on the waterfront? What if it was all open? And what if it was quiet and there were parks and places for people to hang out and enjoy the views, and it was a waterfront for all? Now that was crazy and ridiculous, and people said that wouldn't happen, but we made it happen through a lot of help from a lot of folks. And how did that happen? It's a lot like what's going on with Lit I-5. So Allied Arts had meetings, we talked to folks, we got the ideas out there, we collected ideas from folks. We had a lot of beer and cultures just like this where people got together and just said, what if we did this? What if we did that? We had charrettes like Lit I-5 has had, where folks got together and rolled up their sleeves and thought, well, if we had no viaduct, we could connect Pike Place Market to the waterfront. You could walk right from Pioneer Square straight to the waterfront and connect all that. And those images got created, and then those got put out into the public. People saw them in the paper, and they saw them out and about. People started to get the idea that, wow, this is a great idea. We got more folks involved. We built a coalition with lots and lots of groups and had more beer and cultures and more events until it finally became such a big idea, and there were so many voices behind it, it couldn't be ignored. And it became a thing, and then there were votes, and then the work got going where the taxes were collected, and the engineers got together, and the builders, and now here we are, just about done with our fantastic waterfront, which just is so amazing, which I love. And that's what's going on with Lit I-5 now, with the visioning and the work that's going on. And I think it's really important in the times that we're living in right now to look at the fact that when our voices come together, we can make our voices heard and we can make change, right? We have to fight bad stuff, but along the way, we need to fight for great stuff and things that make our community better. If you'll indulge me for 10 seconds, can you close your eyes and think about our wonderful waterfront and that overlook walk that we've just finished, and how you feel when you're out there and thinking that that could have been another elevated highway, but it is our extended heart of Pike Place Market, and think about how you feel when you're there, right? So that all started with an idea, and folks like you all, folks like we all, to get that vision out there, to make our voices heard and make that vision a reality. So thanks for being here. Thanks for being part of this. All right. I'm going to pass it over to our other co-sponsors. We have Lit I-5 to wrap up, and next we have Seattle Parks Foundation.
Ooh, it's bright up here. Hi, everyone. I'm Shava Lawson from Seattle Parks Foundation. We partner with community to champion thriving and equitable public spaces through fiscal sponsorship. We have over 120 partners across the city working on over 140 projects. There's a few of our projects in the audience tonight, including Lit I-5, who we have been a fiscal sponsor for 10 years. It's exciting to be in partnership together tonight to explore how we could leverage funds to research and plan for Lit I-5. As with any long-term project, as Dave was just talking about. It takes a coalition and a group of people, perseverance, building relationships, and securing funding to move transformative projects along. With that in mind, if you feel inspired to donate to Lit I-5 to support this work and the continued planning for this project, I think there are QR codes around the room placed for you to do so. Wanted to thank Town Hall for hosting this event, and thanks to all for coming and being part of this conversation. Thanks.
Hello. Hi, my name is John Fite. I'm the co-chair of Lit I-5. Welcome. Another name for tonight's topic could have been Reconnecting People, which is at the core of Lit I-5's mission. Reconnecting people happens along streets for pedestrians and cyclists, in parks for active and passive recreation, and via storefronts connecting businesses to customers and residents to services. Connections include views to the Olympic Mountains, the Central Waterfront, and Lake Union. Litting I-5 will allow people to better connect with each other and to our rich landscape, unobstructed and unencumbered by Interstate 5. These links must be within the context of Seattle's other bold visionary plans, such as the Central Waterfront, Seattle Center's 10-year vision, the expansion of Yesler Terrace, and the Reconnect South Park project. The connections provided by the LID must harmonize with WashDOT's I-5 master plan and join people with housing, parks, employment, and the services they rely on every day. They must bridge the 10-block gap separating First Hills Healthcare from the downtown and the CID and enable residents to have equitable access to these vital assets with new options for walking, rolling, and transit. The connections must join downtown's rapidly growing population to the amenity-rich neighborhoods of Capitol Hill, First Hill, and the CID, and make downtown more livable by strengthening its economic, cultural, and social diversity. Replacing vacant tracks and urban blight along I-5 with new gateways will prompt exploration and discovery, and a 40-acre void in the heart of our city will be transformed into a complete and thriving neighborhood. Instead of being divided from one another, Seattle's central neighborhoods will be joined together, promoting safety, stewardship, and vitality. The connections I speak of and that are the topic of tonight's Beer and Culture will only happen if we build this campaign together. We must first become human connectors if we wish to achieve the physical ones we hope for. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thanks to all of you who are here tonight. I got to know many of you starting in 2004 when we did one of the first design charrettes for the waterfront. And at that point, Allied Arts was leading the charge, and so many of you are here tonight. And I just want to recognize Tom Graff. A year ago, we were opening up one of the new areas along the waterfront, and you came up behind me and said it's only taken 20 years to get here, but we've gotten here. And that's the point. And when we're talking about Lit I-5 tonight, I'm excited to be able to introduce this panel. First, I should probably introduce myself. I'm Sally Bagshaw. I'm a former Seattle City Council member, but have been very excited about what this city has done in the last number of years that my husband Brad and I have lived here. So first I want to just dive in, and I'd ask you, if you will, if you can stand it, don't applaud until we get through all of the introductions, and then we will give them a hearty welcome and we'll dive right in. So first, I'm going to introduce Lyle Bicknell, who is in the center. Lyle and I have worked together at the City of Seattle. He is an urban designer. He was the principal urban designer for the City of Seattle and retired last year. He was selected as a fellow for the SCAN Design Professional Group, as well as having been recognized by the U.S. State Department as a Southeast Asian Fellow. He's currently an affiliate faculty member at the UW in the Department of Urban Design and the Department of Landscape Architecture, and he brings with him a lot of information and experience with the City of Seattle, and he continues to promote and advocate for good urban design around our city. Julie Meredith, down on the end. Julie is the new director for WashDOT, Washington State Department of Transportation. Governor Ferguson appointed her just 4 weeks ago, but she's not new in any means to our region. I first got to know Julie when she was working on the 520 project, also on the viaduct and the tunnel. She spent, I think, her entire career in WashDOT, starting as a little technical person and working her way up to where she is now. Is it true you started in forestry at the UW and then became a professional engineer? She is, or had been, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Mega Programs, and then became the Assistant Secretary of Urban Mobility, and now here she is as the Director of WashDOT. We are really lucky to have her in that position because she's somebody who knows how to get things done. My experience with her always was, you get a real sticky problem, you find Julie, and she figures out a way to solve it with you, not for you. I'm so pleased and proud of the work that you did around the viaduct and the tunnel, and when things went to garbage with Bertha, you know, we managed to keep working through that. But she's now working on the Columbia River crossing, and as you probably already know, she's received numerous awards for her leadership and project successes. Our third member of the panel is my buddy Sung Yang. He is principal with the firm of the Pacific Public Affairs, but I knew Sung when he was Deputy King County Executive. Also, he worked with Greg Nichols when Greg was mayor, and I think you were Chief of Staff for City Light. Am I right on that? I think that's where you and I first connected. He's currently the board chair for the Downtown Seattle Association, so if you have any questions about downtown businesses, he's the guy to direct them to. He's also on the board of Seattle Center Foundation, East Rail Partners, Seattle Academy, and a number of arts organizations that I remember. He's had 2 decades of experience in managing public policy issues, legislative affairs, communications, political campaigns, coalition building, and public opinions research. All 3 of my panelists are University of Washington graduates. They are exactly the right people at the right time to be talking about this. So please welcome Sung Yang, Lyle Bicknell, and Julie Meredith. First question I have is just by way of letting people know what you're doing currently. Could you do a 30-second lightning round and talk about what you are working on right now that is bringing you either some joy or some excitement? Do you want to start with Julie?
All right. Again, I'd like to thank you for having me here tonight. It's been great to meet everybody. As Sally said, I'm Julie Meredith. I'm the new Secretary of Transportation. I have had 4 weeks on the job. So it's been a lot coming at you all at once. And the thing that really excites me about what I'm doing now is the opportunity to work with so many different people across the entire state. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent, it's been really refreshing to see the conversations that have unfolded. There's a lot of issues that they have to tackle this SLED session, which is underway, and I guess the thing that I'm jazzed about is that they talk to each other, they're civil, and it just gives me hope that we can resolve the issues. So that's what jazzed me.
30 seconds, wow. I'm working on a couple of interrelated cool things, going from the macro to the micro. I'm working with some folks to preserve and relocate, I think, the last vestige of the Alaskan Way Viaduct, which is this really cool Art Deco historic sign bridge, which was on the viaduct, but we're now relocating it to Bell Street. It'll be an art, cultural element there across Bell Street and Belltown. And thanks to Julie and SDOT, the groundbreaking for this project took place earlier this month, and it will be complete by summer. And connected to that is the other thing that I'm working on, which is Market to Mohi, a history trail that goes, a pedestrian trail that goes from the Pike Place Market to the Museum of History and Industry, with history information all along the way. I am a firm believer that when a city loses its history, it loses its soul.
Son?
Well, Sally, first, I just want to thank you for letting me join you in this great panel tonight. I guess the cool and inspirational thing is just being here, because only in Seattle can you get 140 people out on a weeknight for land use. So you guys are all wonks. Congratulations. And the only other thing I would just say, you know, Sally mentioned that I serve on the Seattle Center Foundation. Memorial Stadium is something that is very exciting and will be happening. But there's a lot of other things that you're going to be hearing about that's going on at the Seattle Center, which is a passion of mine. In fact, your next speaker at the next Beer and Culture event is Marshall Foster. So if you come to that event, maybe you can get Marshall to reveal all of the cool things that he's working on.
That's great, thanks, son. I've been asked if I would give a 1-minute intro to how we got here. Now that's 1 minute to cover 75 years of history, but let's get started with the 1956 Federal Highway Act. Also known as the National Interstate and Defense Highway Act. It was something 11 years after World War II. Then President Eisenhower was very enthused about it, in no small part for him. He saw it as a defense effort. But the bill authorized $25 billion for 41,000 miles of highway across the United States. It was considered at that time to be one of the largest public works projects ever, even more so than what we heard during FDR's regime. They had 90% federal funding for the 41,000 miles, and it connected major cities to each other. It improved freight times, created jobs, reduced delay, and increased trade. Now, the downside was that many communities were severed. And as you know, in any kind of a major highway program, they don't go through the affluent neighborhoods. And in many of the larger cities, we saw neighborhoods that were primarily lived in by Black Americans, but Black and brown people found themselves in a situation where their houses were condemned. By and large, they were not landowners. So somebody who did own a home got compensated, even though it might have been not at full price. But people that were renters found themselves out of homes. And USDOT statistics say that over 1 million people lost their homes during that particular first 20 years. So tonight we're going to be learning more about how we reconnect parts of our city. Big cities, New York, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New Orleans, all of them were impacted by that. Many of the cities are already seeing the kinds of connections that we're talking about tonight. I know Lyle can talk a little bit more about this, but Freeway Park was one of the very first lids that was created. Not the first, but one of the first, and then it followed with Mercer Island. So we're not strangers at all to the positive value of having a lid. But I do want to recognize how many people were left out in the cold because of what happened now 75 years ago. So, Sung, I'm going to ask you first to set the stage for us. How did the new highways impact the people of Seattle, and what do you think are the next steps?
Well, and just to build upon maybe some of the background points you provided, Sally, the highway projects were undeniably successful in connecting cities across the United States. And not only was it the largest public works project at the time, but I believe it was the largest construction project in the history of humankind. So, you know, to this day, it is a marvel of civic engineering and construction, but as Sally had mentioned, it came at enormous, and now in hindsight, multi-generational cost. The benefits were not uniformly experienced, as the new interstate system, as was the case here in Seattle, gutted communities and sometimes intentionally reinforced racist practices such as redlining and segregation. And communities across the country, but certainly here in Seattle, lost places of worship, green space, whole swaths of homes. There was an estimate of a recent study that suggested over 1 million people, mostly renters, were displaced and had to find new homes. Neighborhoods lost small businesses that provided jobs and that kept money circulating locally. So this is the dark side that we're beginning to reckon with the history of this project, and something that we need to correct. You know, we think of our own city here again in Seattle, where I-5, as you saw in a lot of the posters around us, literally split and severed our city. And also, same with the Alaskan Way Viaduct, which previously severed our waterfront. But I guess as is maybe the positive case there, if we can reopen our waterfront, which I understand is going to be happening here very shortly, then I'm hopeful that we can reconnect Capitol Hill to downtown.
Well done. Thank you. Building on that, Julie, I'm going to ask you this question, that over the years, the federal government has not followed through with adequate funding. Some of the promises that were made, such as maintaining the original construction, as we have all seen, all you have to do is get off on leaving I-5 and get on some of the ramps, and you have to kind of check to see if you still have your teeth afterward. So in Washington, many of these freeways and ramps have been patched up and continue to be repaired piecemeal. Some of the neighborhoods have been totally ignored, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about WashDOT's position with the feds and future funding needs. And by the way, we will get into the question that we all want to know is what's happening after the last 4 weeks in the federal government. But right now, I'd just like to focus on WashDOT.
So I can't just talk about preservation in the feds without acknowledging that all of those projects that Sally said I had the great opportunity to work on, those were possible because our state legislature funded them. So when you read my resume, it'll say I got to work on $16 billion of infrastructure, which was fantastic and did a lot of really great things, a lot of it for the city of Seattle and the Puget Sound. But what didn't get funded through the last 25 years then was commensurate investment in preservation across the state. So it just, if you think about it, would you rather put new windows in your house or take a trip to someplace exotic? And so that's sort of what we've been doing for the last 20 years. And I like to travel too. So the IIJA, which was the last Biden administration's investment in infrastructure, it was a good down payment on what we need to do. But as we think going forward, what I promised Senator Elias and Rep. Vise that I would work on preservation with them, and I would work on what we need to do to get us back to the state of good repair. And I actually said I would make preservation sexy again. So if anybody has any ideas on how to do that, I need some help.
So maybe you talk a little bit more about the legislature and maybe even Congress, if that's something that in your first 4 weeks that you've had opportunity to reach out to our senators and some of our local congressmen, just to see how things are going.
I will say it's a really fluid time. I had the executive orders hit our inboxes early in the Trump administration, and over 3 days we still weren't quite sure what those executive orders meant. WashDOT has a really strong relationship with FHWA, FTA, and FRA.
I'm going to tell people what those acronyms are.
Pardon me?
Would you just say what those
Oh,
acronyms are?
FHWA, FTA is the Federal Transit Authority, and FRA is the Federal Railroad Association. Sorry, government speaks in a lot of those things. We have a really strong relationship with those agencies, and even they aren't sure what it means. So we got, like for electronic vehicles and charging, we got a grant for that. We've obligated about 10% of that money, and that's going to be spent. What happens with the other 90% is an open question, and we're not sure. Just yesterday, I got an email from the Federal Transit Authority, and they said they have had to let go all their probationary staff and that new staffing cuts will come. They don't know what that means. So every day is something new, and it's pretty fluid. That's my nicest way of saying it comes at us every day, and we have to figure out what it means. We're really lucky to have strong federal senators engaged in this process. So Senator Cantwell has been engaged on the IBR, that's the Interstate Bridge, and Sally called it the CRC, Columbia River Crossing. So she's been engaged in that and very mindful, because that program has over $2 billion of federal dollars dedicated to its replacement, and it is a preservation project at its heart. So again, we feel lucky to have the senators we have engaged, but I will share more when we know more. Yep.
Lyle, you are an urban planner, and a lot of us are interested in what other cities are doing, what other LIDs have looked like. What do you see, and who is leading the charge on what Seattle could become with the LIDs?
Yeah, you know, I'm actually an urban designer as opposed to an urban planner, and you might wonder, no, not at all. What's the distinction? Aren't they the same thing? Well, I would say they're slightly different in that urban designers help take public policy, public plans, and make them three-dimensional. And ideally, in that process, in a humanizing way. And I think the experience that, well, we've certainly had together is how do you do that? And before I get to other cities, I think I'd like to make just a few observations of some kind of lessons learned in our process so far. First of all, I'd like to start with the observation that Americans have perfected the art of getting 2 acres to do the work of 1. What really makes for interesting, exciting, and engaging places is when you can get 1 acre to do the work of 2. And let me just give you an example of that. You can picture in your mind the Pike Place Market, the entrance to the Pike Place Market at Pike Place and Pike Street. There's the clock, there's the sign, there's food for sale, there's flowers for sale, there's a busker, there's a pig, there's stairs down to the waterfront, there's stairs down to Post Alley, there's fish flying through the air. If you look up, and I encourage you to do so, there is a 5-panel piece of art that is a memorial to the Japanese internment during World War II. And it's a piece so powerful, I cannot stop tearing up when I see it. It is just an extraordinary piece. But it speaks to all the things that are going on in this area that's less than 5,000 square feet. And here's the thing of it. That space works fabulously on a sunny summer Saturday, but it also works well and comfortably on a wet February night. And during that time, it just feels like it's a space waiting for something to happen the next day, as opposed to a space that's derelict or dangerous. Contrasted against how we often do contemporary modern spaces, which we have a huge windswept plaza, and maybe we'll have 1 pig, and maybe a busker on alternating Tuesdays. So my point is that to make these spaces work, and this is something we've found both here, but also from examples around the country, activation, thoughtful activation, really finding uses that are engaging, rather than just trying to activate retroactively a bad space is problematic. And I would draw an example of a good project, Clyde Warren LID in Dallas, which is a hugely successful open space in a city that has not had a lot of great urban design, and to their credit, they've done it beautifully, well-programmed, well-activated, with spaces and uses that are attractive and accessible to everybody. And I think that is an example of something that's done well. A project which certainly cost a lot, but maybe wasn't as successful, maybe for some of the reasons that I've illuminated, was the Rose Kennedy Greenway in Boston, which produced a lot of new public space, but the spaces are not necessarily well activated or well connected. And because there's a lot of them, you have that problem of what is this? And the other challenge that we have with lidding, and I think this applies pretty much anywhere you're lidding over a highway, a freeway, is you have the adjacencies. You often have on-ramps or off-ramps. You have a context that's not very conducive to creating a great public space. So thinking about activation, thinking about connections, if I can just draw on one more experience that, Julie and I have had over much of our career, which is the SR 520, where the original proposal was just this big, massive lid. And it was expensive, and worst of all, you couldn't actually cross it as a pedestrian in a reasonable way. It was like this crazy, disconnected kind of pedestrian nightmare. And I will give WashDOT enormous credit. They brought great designers, great urban designers together, combined with thoughtful designers from the city side, and we crafted a solution that was much smarter. It was a significantly reduced lid in size, but the connection, the land bridge, which is this really elegant pedestrian bike connection that crosses the highway in a intuitive, graceful, pleasant and engaging manner. That was less of a lid, but ultimately it was a better outcome. So really thinking about how do people actually use this thing, and how can we make sure that we respond to those needs, the needs for activation, the need for comfort, the need for intuitive design. How can we do that well? And I will point out, as an extra bonus, the solution that we came up ultimately saved the taxpayers tens of millions of dollars. Did you get a thank you note, Julie? I never got a thank you note. But the point is, and I guess I'm making a plug here for thoughtful design. Really think about these things as their function, reuniting, knitting together neighborhoods that have been torn apart, more than simply just capping a freeway or as an engineering project.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a very thoughtful response. And I will say thank you for all of the work that you did on 520. And I was still on city council at that time, and there were so many conversations and looking at what could we be doing, and it really has been a remarkable connector from the Arboretum over to the UW, and so big thank you and kudos to you.
I accept the thank you, but it wouldn't have been possible without the many, many, many people, like the people here, collaborating to make it happen. So I just feel lucky that I got to be there. Yes.
So switching back to you, Sung, you are well known for your political acumen. I know, take it. And when have you seen Seattle at its best, and how can we take that best to apply to the lid?
Well, as you know, I also love history. I know David Brewster loves history, and probably many of you in this room love history. And I think that when we reflect back on our city's history, we're at its best when we have a bold idea and we figure out a way and build the political will to realize that bold idea. And I would imagine that many you are all here not because you want to be here to talk about land use, but because you're excited about this bold idea. And so I reflect back, at least, just looking back on our own history, like in 1889, we had a huge Seattle fire, almost lost our city. The very next day, if you know that, wonderful story, people came together and said, we're going to rebuild this story. They could have done, we could all be in Tacoma having this conversation, but no, we decided to stay here and plant our roots. 1949, we had people who had the foresight to go up to Whatcom County and build Ross Dam for our publicly owned electric utility, which now has provided generations of renewable hydroelectric power for all of us to be able to enjoy. We hosted the 1962 World's Fair that gave us the Seattle Center. We had Forward Thrust in 68 and 1970 that gave us King County Metro that helped clean up Lake Washington at the time. We built Freeway Park, which, as my daughter would say, is the OG lid. We had Washington State Convention Center thereafter in '88. We had the viaduct demolition in 2019. We had the new aquarium and the Overlook Walk that was just discussed just last year. And now we're going to reopen the waterfront after demolishing the viaduct. We're going to move forward with light rail expansion. So there is a lot happening. And even though this project seems daunting, if you think about it in that context, it is actually a logical progression of the kinds of assets that we need to build to make a more livable and sustainable city.
Yeah, well done. One thing that I wanted to say to the Allied Arts crew out here is how important it was for our designers and the landscape architects and those of you who can actually draw, how you made a difference with what the waterfront became. Because as an attorney and somebody who would write a lot of reports, they just end up in somebody's drawer at best, if not in the recycle. But when you guys started drawing and people could see it, it was that level of excitement where people said, that's what we want. And I remember talking with Governor Gregoire, and when I just, laid out these visions that people that with your skill set made a giant difference in people's acceptance of this project. So that's where I see LID I-5 going now, because there's already been 2 design charrettes, I think one in 2016 and 2018, but I know there's a lot more interest in taking it to the whole next level. So I want to come back to you, Julie, about ways that Seattle and WashDOT can work together to make the LID I-5 vision part of your master plan. Because I know you've got a statewide master plan, you've got I-5 from Vancouver down to Portland essentially underway. How do you see us working together so that the LID I-5 could be something that could actually happen?
So before I got my current job, the thing that most excited me, the thing that got me up and going to work every day was the I-5 master plan, which, as she said, is Oregon to Canada. And we worked really hard last year to get a grant from the Federal Railroad Administration to look at high-speed rail. And that, of course, started in Portland and ended in Vancouver, British Columbia, 2 really great partner cities who have really enthusiastic, bold people working there. And we were included in AASHTO. I've actually forgotten what the letters stand for, but it's a transportation group, a national transportation group, and they included us in what they called their Moonshot program. So our goal on that program is to look at I-5, high-speed rail, and air mobility, all of those modes together, look out over the next 50 years or beyond when we have another 3 to 4 million people moving here, and ask the question, what will these modes do? How will we get around? What land use do we need to support these modes? How will our communities connect? And that was a transformative thing. How will we work together with LID I-5? We need to work together with them in parallel when we're going to do our outreach later this year on the other Moonshot. We'll be working with the LID I-5 group so that we can incorporate their thoughts into the I-5 master plan with the work that we're doing. And I'll put my little plug in. This is probably one of the worst budget seasons I've ever seen. So I'll be working really hard to make sure that our I-5 master plan money stays in the budget. But again, that's a decision by the legislature. And of course, we're keeping an eye on what the feds do with our federal dollars. So, but the only way that we can work together to make this happen is to collaborate on what comes next. And the thing that started off the Lascaux Viaduct was to note that it was a vulnerable structure. And over the last several years, we've done an analysis of I-5 through the city, and it isn't just the bridges that are vulnerable. We built those walls, we built the off-ramps. Those are all structures designed under a very old and now non-standard design criteria, and we wouldn't do that today. So.
Thank you. Do you have some enthusiasm around what Seattle and what this group is looking at that we can actually integrate with your plans?
What we're looking at is how the connections will work on I-5. So if you start redoing the connections and understanding how that moves people around differently, how they will move. One of the things that we spent a lot of time talking about is what is on the lids. Some of the places that you talked about, the lids are capping a very congested area, and how if you put new transportation, you put new housing on it, you put new buildings on it, how is that going to help the area around it? So you have to be very thoughtful about what goes on the lid and how that interrelates to the neighborhoods and the roadways. I think that's where we could really make a difference together. What does the community want? What does the city want? And how can that partner with what we need to do on I-5?
Thank you. Back to you, Sung. I would like to follow up on the meaning of resiliency. That is a word that we hear all the time on whether or not a project is going to be resilient. And in the long-term, resiliency is a common theme I hear all the time. And you are chair of Downtown Seattle Association, and one of the most admired chairs, I will say. And we appreciate the fact that the economic status quo is tough downtown. And resiliency means improved economy, but also more people coming down, better pedestrian connections, people feel safe. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the connections. How do we prioritize these? Where is the business community in all of this? And how can the business community step up and be part of this?
So thank you for those comments. I will really owe you after this panel. But, you know, I think maybe before the pandemic, this idea of resiliency was more academic, but if there's one thing we learned from the pandemic, resiliency does really matter. And the Downtown Seattle Association, just by way of background, is not just a business association, but it also exists to operate the cities and partners with the cities to operate the BIA and the Metropolitan Improvement District. And it also exists to support the residents. And what I would say is that one of the things that made downtown and continues to make downtown resilient and leads to the value proposition for the LID is the residents of downtown. I think probably this is a very well-informed crowd. You all know that downtown Seattle grew faster than probably one of the any urban center in the decade prior to the pandemic. The Seattle itself grew at the most rapid clip of any city in the country, and one of the primary reasons was because of downtown and downtown residents like Sally and probably many of you here. So that is really important because it was policies that were enacted by leaders like Sally and other council members that made downtown more livable, but it's not something that can exist by itself. People came down to downtown Seattle because they saw the ecosystem of the things that make living downtown great. You know, whether it's arts and culture, whether it's strong retail, whether it's entertainment, open space. So all of these things are important, and it will be even more important as we're trying to attract more growth to increase density, not only in downtown Seattle, but also in the adjacent neighborhoods of Capitol Hill, where that is all, prior to downtown, Capitol Hill was the most densest residential neighborhood in the city of Seattle. And so it makes sense that an asset like a LID project is important to create resiliency on two levels. First is, because downtown is a destination and it's a job center, having more amenities is going to be important, but also if the city's policy is to grow that residential population in downtown, in areas like Capitol Hill, we need to have these kinds of amenities that will provide those kinds of connections, make living in this and working in this part of Seattle that much richer and joyful. So that's what I think.
Excellent answer. Lyle, I want to come back to you on this idea of connections, especially since you're working on Market to Mohi, and thanks to you and to John Pearson and others for the vision. But there is wonderful connections, and I want to recognize Shannon Nichols. I don't think she's with us tonight, but she was one of the speakers at our first Beer and Culture on this topic, and she did some great designs, and her firm on Pike and Pine connections. And so my vision is just imagine what we now have on our waterfront, and with that overlook walk and being able to walk up through Pike Place Market and straight up Pike and Pine to like Melrose Center up on Capitol Hill. Just, can you describe a little bit more about how do we connect that with the lid? How do we take Freeway Park, move that south, move it north, but just imagine the green space that we're able to create through that.
It's a great point, and we have this now terrific corridor on the waterfront. How do we build on that? And I think the vision of the perpendicular, in other words, a number of corridors, of streets, connections that are perpendicular to the waterfront, that take you up across to First Hill, to Capitol Hill, through the International District, is a really compelling idea. Because we have some of them now. Some are missing. Some are just not there that need to be there. Some are there now, and they're horrible. And so how we prioritize what we do with those, I think it's important to work collaboratively, as Julie pointed out, but not only across kind of all transportation modes, but also what are going to be the activators. You know, already just with the lids we've done so far, Freeway Park as a park project, Convention Center as a convention facility, those were ways and strategies for actually making this happen. I think we should be looking for other opportunities, and it's going to be serendipitous. We can't identify them now, but how do we tie and pair those with the corridors that we want to enhance initially, recognizing that this might not be an all-at-once thing. If Julie finds a pot of gold and we rebuild I-5 all at once, that would be great. But the reality is we'll probably be working segmentally, and so prioritizing where those crossings want to be first, what are some of the synergisms that we can work with to get there, and also maybe time is actually our friend, that it doesn't have to be done all at once. We learn as we go, we strengthen as we go, and we capture opportunities that we're not even aware of for collaboration as we go.
Lyle, that's a really good point. I think with this, that there's a sense of, well, we've got to do it all at once, but if we can do it incrementally and make one block tie into the next block, and whether we're having partnerships with the private owners on the side, that suddenly we're able to see a vision that can come, maybe it's 10 years or 15 years, but it is doable. I know that there are certain naysayers in this crowd. I'm looking at one over there who has said to me, oh, this will never happen. You know, there are certain people who's like, no, it's not. And I keep saying it is happening in other cities. We know it can happen here. Can you talk a little bit more about the elements that have been successful in some of the other cities?
Yeah, I mean, they vary. They are some projects that are 100% public space. There's no private anything, all the way to, say, Capitol Crossings in Washington, D.C., which is essentially 100% private. And so there's that whole spectrum of consideration. I think there were some hopes early on that if we added enough private components to these projects, to these lids, they might pay for themselves or at least pay for a significant cost. Given the complexity of our topography and the geometry of I-5, that we learned is probably not realistic. And so cost for doubters, cost is a real thing that we need to think about. But it's worth pointing out, you know, we've already done 2 lids over I-5 in the last 50 years. And when you look regionally, we've done scores of lids. So we know how to do these things. We know how to pay for these things. I just think you get a richer outcome when you can collaborate, when you can find different ways of paying for these things. One piece of advice is help solve someone else's problem at the same time. And if you can do that, that'll not only make a more fiscally achievable solution, it'll actually make a better design solution because you'll have more considerations which will give you a richer outcome.
Yeah, well said. We talked a little bit ago about Montlake and the connection both with the pedestrian and bicycle, but can you talk a little bit, Julie, about how you brought the community along? And by the way, I saw a friend, Barbara Wright, last night. She wanted me to say hello to you, that she reminded me that she was one of the thorns in your side, but that she always appreciated very much how collaborative you were with her. So can you talk a little bit about what you would recommend going forward for us and that we can be as collaborative as possible?
I will say the Montlake community gave me a run for my money, which was not a surprise to anybody here. But the good thing about the Montlake community is they weren't shy about telling us what they wanted, and so they did engage. It's almost impossible to get ideas from some communities when they, for whatever reasons, don't participate. So I'll say I think we were fortunate that we got as much participation as we did to decide what we were going to build there. The city was engaged. I feel SDOT, we got the best of SDOT when we were working with SDOT at the time, and Lyle was part of those conversations. And we didn't stop collaborating when we got one answer. It's been continuous. And there's always things we wish we could do better and perfect. There's the consequences and the unintended consequences. That happens, but when you keep the collaboration going, like Lyle said, that lid was, it looked like your map here of your lids, it was a box over the freeway. And as we got closer to Seattle and got closer to Seattle, it became clear that just wasn't the best approach. And we just kept talking to the neighborhood. We gathered, we had various practices. We would meet, and I think at times I met with everybody along Lake Washington Boulevard, or the team did. And it takes that kind of input, I think, to get a conclusion that, as Lyle said, is richer than it would have been otherwise. And it's hard work. So if you think we're gonna just be done here tonight, I just wanna say, Lyle spent months talking to us, months, as did many other people at the City of Seattle and at Metro and the U. And we spent many, many nights trying to figure out how to get it done, and then going down to Olympia and said, no, this is really what we need to do. So it was a collaboration from the neighborhood to the local jurisdiction to the UW. Sound Transit was a big part of that. So all of that needed to take place.
Yeah, you brought this up a few minutes ago about working with the businesses downtown. We know that the businesses, the urbanists, park enthusiasts, many more people have been involved in this I-5 project over the last 10 years. And thanks to all of you out there who have been working on the I-5 project, you board members have been dedicated. How would you say that we can do more of that, build the enthusiasm that is going to be needed in the long run?
Well, we talked about building political will earlier, and you know, this project has had a technical feasibility, which shows that it can be done. And I would argue that you also need to have a political feasibility study that can determine whether sufficient political will can be established. And that's where I actually think this project and initiative has enormous strategic advantage. You know, there's 3 power centers in Seattle. There's labor, there's business, and there's the environmentalists. And at any time you can align all 3 of those interests, you have an extremely viable project. And I would argue that you need that alignment when you're talking about a project of this scale. But again, the good news is you should be able to garner that kind of support. When you look back over the course, you know, over the last 25 years, any major transportation, capital, asset type project, it has included some combination of those 3 power centers. And so that is critical. I mean, you think about what it took to build the political coalition for Sound Transit 3, you know, largest tax increase in the history of this region, but that took business, labor, and the environmentalists coming together. The convention center project being able to go through despite the cost of that project, but also the economic benefits that presented. The central waterfront, all of these things required a very intentional effort to build this kinds of coalition. The good news is there's a lot of people in this room that have had long history with being able to form those kinds of coalitions. I think I saw Amy Grotefend here earlier, who's like built every single political coalition on the transportation side. So the muscle is there, and it's really a matter of how we build that political will and bring in these constituencies. And the final step is we do need to have a strong leader, whether it's the mayor, somebody who is going to be able to make this a priority for the city. That will be necessary, and that can come one of two ways. Either it becomes the kind of the self-professed priority of that particular leader, or it happens because elected leaders sometimes follow the crowd, and it's the crowd that forces that to happen. It can also come from a community group or, such as this, or private individuals. I mean, a lot of the projects that happened that we talked about in the past that were successful were because of the work of Jim Ellis, in this. So the good news is there's no specific recipe you have to follow, but you do need some of the common ingredients.
Somebody recently asked me, well, where's the next Jim Ellis? Well, I think that time has passed to have one guy or a handful of people that are leading this charge. And the last time we were together, I said, it's the people in this room that are going to make this happen, that we are the coalition that are going to keep it going. You look at the waterfront, when we got started, it was before Greg Nichols. And, think of the number of mayors that we had between then and now to Bruce Harrell. And the enthusiasm that kept pushing were the people that had the vision to say, this can get done, and it did. A story that I've told many times, but is absolutely gospel. When I was working with David Yeaworth and David Allen and others with the Allied Arts originally, I was literally patted on the head. I swear to goodness, literally patted on the head by a politician who said to me, oh, you guys are so cute. It is not going to happen. It can't happen. But it did happen, and partly it was just the doggedness of people who had the vision to say it's going to happen, and we're going to make it so. So clearly, like Sung was saying, it was business, it was labor, it was environmentalists. Also say there was a pretty strong women's group that was engaged too. And the women's engineers, thank you so much, that they were able to articulate things to me personally, and I very much appreciated all of that. Okay, Lyle, back to you. I want to talk about some of the benefits of this LID, not just in what we're looking at, but what other cities have done. And you talked about Dallas and DC. I saw a vision in Boston of the Fenway Center. I couldn't believe it. This is across the major freeway, but they have a building on top of that. So can you talk a little bit more about what you have seen, the benefits for the cities?
Yeah, I think there's the obvious benefit. There's restoration, restoring connection, all of the positives that come from correcting a terrible mistake of the past. But I think one of the great things, and the waterfront certainly proved this to be the case, but I think the Living by 5 is the next thing. I think there's a powerful statement about a place making things better, demonstrably making something that's not great better. And that's why I am especially excited about this proposal, because I feel like we need that thing right now. It's been a rough last 5 or 6 years, and not just improving connections to the downtown, making the downtown work better, but also just the fundamental statement about investment and caring and energy and all the things that come when you can champion a successful project like this. And I think that's been the case certainly for Dallas, which, as I said, never really had a strong sense of itself or any kind of downtown pride. We see these kinds of investments as more than just a technical solution, but really a statement about place and a statement about the future.
I hate to dive into politics, but I'm going to for just a moment. The prior administration put over $1 trillion into infrastructure, and we all know that bipartisan infrastructure bill, also known as Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. What did you call it? Just IIJA? It just came right off your tongue. These objectives that our President Biden saw were to grow the economy, enhance our competitiveness, create good jobs, make our economy more sustainable, resilient, and just. Oh my goodness. To date, there's been 66,000 projects that have been funded by that money, and they're obviously not done. They are just getting going. And so now, if that money is pulled back, where does that leave us? We have seen chaos generated in the last 4 weeks. I know we don't have an answer. None of us do, and it's changing 5 times a day, as you pointed out, Julie. But talk about how do we deal with this?
Well, I think I told Sally I haven't been reading the news since November, so I started again since I got this job, and I felt I should actually be responsible and read the news. I think things are never as bad as they look. So today it does look dire, and even when it's great, it's never as good. So I offer you that middle of the round here. I think it will flatten out here in a bit, and I think the only way that we can make it better is to engage in ways like we are here tonight, and let our leadership know what we think is important. Just like Sally described that bill has all the values that we here in Washington State hold dear. And I'm really fortunate that Governor Inslee and Governor Ferguson share those values and are going to lead on that. So that's excellent. I think when we think about infrastructure, just to not be so political, when we think about the infrastructure from the 50s and how we viewed it to how we have to think about it in the next 50 years, people are going to require different mobility. We may still work from home. We're going to need more resources in our neighborhoods. We're going to, air mobility will be a thing. Things that we didn't think were important to our lives, like broadband, are going to be important to the future, and the utilities necessary to support all that have also been underinvested in. So when we think about transportation and infrastructure, it needs to include all of those things. And I think because as we were back in DC making the pitch for why investment in Washington was important, and the skepticism we heard last year, it was Washingtonians know what they value and they're ready to help support paying for it. And we just need you to help us with that. And all the things my co-panelists said about light rail and backing that and backing the waterfront, those are the things I think that are going to help us. So Big Brother's not going to help us. We're going to make it happen here. And this meeting tonight is what starts that.
Well, we know we're going to experience turbulence for a while. And probably a lot of those 66,000 projects are at risk. Election results matter, but the other thing about elections is if you didn't like the last results, the next one is right around the corner. So,
I just wanted to remind everyone, I'm a native. I actually remember the 70s. We were a company town in the 60s and 70s. And in the early 70s, Boeing lost, in a very short period of time, something like 60,000 employees. I mean, that was devastating. And yet, somehow, in that decade, we managed to preserve the market, establish a historic district in Pioneer Square, the aquarium, and, importantly, Freeway Park. Now, those were different times, obviously different funding, but there's a community that's definitely on its knees, somehow able to come together and do some really great things. So maybe the dark times, well, they will pass, but also maybe they're a motivator for us to get together and do great things.
Julie, did I hear somebody clap out there? Yes, I agree. Julie, is there anything those of us in this room can do to support WashDOT's effort, either with the legislature or with Congress right now, or with our senators?
Well, I will say with the state legislature, it's in session now. So COVID did bring us one good thing, and that is you can participate remotely on that. And if you want to, you can go down and testify for what you value. So I encourage you to participate in the legislative process. It's going right now, and this is a long session, so it'll go until April. But now's the time to get your voices heard down there. If you think that things need to change in DC, now is the time to make your voice heard and contact your leadership. I'm neutral here, as you can tell. Yeah.
We appreciate that and appreciate the position, and I know that asking you that question is tough, but we all want to know, how's that going to impact WashDOT? I've got one question left for Sung, and then I've got a lightning round. And I'm looking at my watch, John Fight, wherever you are. Can we take a few more minutes and do lightning round and then open it up to Q&A? Okay, so Sung, one of the things that we have learned in the waterfront is that it did take 20 years, but bringing people together, and as I talked about with the vision, with the designers and the landscape architects and those that could just see what I could not see, it made a difference. But I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about what lessons we learned from the waterfront that could be applied to I-5.
Yeah, and there's a lot of great lessons. And again, at the next beer and culture meeting, you're going to have Marshall Foster, who presumably is going to be able to recount a lot of those great lessons. But I would say for the purposes of today's discussion, you know, the one successful lesson which may be applied on a list of the next to-do things for this project is that the Central Waterfront formed a stewardship entity that helped institutionalize and maintain momentum and continuity of this project across multiple mayoral administrations. So for those of you that have been following that project, Friends of the Waterfront came together. An external group of civic leaders were there not only to be boosters, but also to maintain accountability of the project with its city partners. And so it seems to me that that kind of a public-private partnership is similarly going to be necessary for something of this scale and complexity, but to really institutionalize that by forming some kind of a stewardship entity, as was done in the waterfront, would be something that would continue to be able to carry this project across multiple administrations, elections, until we get to the finish line, as will be the case here very, very shortly for the opening of the Central Waterfront.
Very good point. I don't know if anybody here is from Friends of the Waterfront, but they've done an extraordinary job, plus raising, what was it, $170 million? And that kind of philanthropy made all the difference in the world. David Yeworth used to call it the sizzle on the steak, that the city, the government of King County, the city, the state, the feds put in the money so that we could do the things that you don't really see, but the stuff up on top that just makes it joyful. A lot of it was raised by the Friends of the Waterfront, and we're really grateful to Maggie Walker and others who did that. Okay, lightning round questions. So we touched on this a little bit about the naysayers, people saying it's too expensive or it takes too long to build the community. How do you respond to the naysayers? Sung, let's start here.
Well, again, I look back on all of the important projects that this city has ever undertaken, and you know, if the naysayers had won, we would never have gotten those great things. I don't want to sound crass, but at the end of the day, you get what you pay for, you know, and that's true for anything in life as well as for public amenities. If we want good things, we have to be able to invest the time, the collective effort, organizing, and then to eventually figure out ways to pay for it. It doesn't have to all come from the public sector, but it certainly is going to require some kind of financing to get it done.
I had a full head of hair when I started working on 520. So there is, I think, just a natural skepticism because these projects take so long, when we can even get them off the ground. And the reality is, a lot of some of Seattle's best decisions have been the ones that we didn't do, like the Munson plan that would have demolished the market, or the R.H. Thompson Expressway. So not every new idea necessarily needs to be implemented quickly. But I think when you have a group of folks like this who are bringing a raft of expertise to a problem that is clearly identifiably an issue, I think that's how we make great things. That's how we make great things happen. And also that gives the durability, as you mentioned, that we need to work across administrations and across governances. You really do need that collection to bring it home.
Well, I think they've answered the question for you, but I think just an example on the Alaska Viaduct, you had a partnership between the city, the state, the county, the port, Metro. It took all of those voices, and then it took all the community to keep them together to make sure it happened, and I think that's what they described.
I think that's absolutely right. Okay, so if amazingly enough, suddenly in DC, we had some interest in investing in this infrastructure and connections, what steps would you say we would want to take to make the I-5 lid a reality? Lyle, you get to go first this time.
Well, I would say that one thing that needs to be done is already happening. The Lid I-5 folks have just done an extraordinary job building a large base, getting the support of just a large number, as you talked about, the kind of the key people you need to have in the room to build stability. I think the next thing, because we did a very substantial study that looked at the fiscal and the structural feasibility of lidding, and now it's really about what do we want this lid, how can this idea of lidding really further our civic objectives, and to do it when, and again, I-5 has been great with this, Lid I-5 folks have been great with this, showing pictures, showing graphics. That worked for the waterfront too, helping people understand what the vision is, because then you can bring them along, and that's such a key part. Before you start any kind of construction, before you begin that phase, helping people understand the vision and getting meaningful input that will make the project that much better.
In order for this Lid I-5 to become part of the I-5 vision, I think we need to work together. The master plan, as we see it, sets the footprint. So our first goal is really to protect the asset that we have and make it more, as you said, resilient. We can't lose the asset while we're trying to decide what to do with it. But as we go forward, the way that this happens is if WashDOT, the city, and you work together to create a cohesive vision for what happens through the city. That there's no other way through it. It's either together or we can't get it done. So.
All right, last final question. What have you heard tonight, maybe that's new, or that has inspired you to keep going?
I guess I would just say, there was a lot of mention about other communities that have built these kinds of projects at the same scale. And I feel like if Dallas can do it, Seattle definitely should be able to do it, okay?
I just think this is great. I think that you can have folks come together like this tonight to have a rich discussion, one of three, mind you. We've got one more coming up. I think that is just absolutely inspiring, and it speaks to a city that can get things done.
I think what inspired me is that I need to hire this guy to help me do the Columbia River Bridge to get the coalition together.
Whatever it takes. All right, well, would you join me in thanking these panelists? And John, do you want to take Q&A?
So we have a microphone here, so please come up with your questions, and just step up, form a queue if there are enough of them, and Try to keep them questions and not necessarily statements, unless the statements are very important to the question. But we have some really good, knowledgeable people here, so let's take advantage of that.
It looks like Mr. Paul Crane's got the first question.
I thought I'd start things off as an Allied Arts rabble-rouser. Anyway. Sally, you mentioned lids, and we've all talked about lids in other cities, but you missed one between Mercer Island and Seattle, which is next to the brand-new light rail station in the, it's also home to NAM, the Northwest African American Museum, and Jimi Hendrix Park, which is visited whenever I go up there by many people from all over the world. Hendrix was well known globally before he was in Seattle, and more so in Seattle. So the question I'm coming up with.
No, I'm not going to interrupt you other than to say, what do we call that? Is it Pruitt Park lid?
It's got several names. The community came up with a name, but the Parks Department, as usual, gave it the names they wanted to, and it's about 4 different but we all call it the I-90 lid. That's the I-90 lid. We all call it the I-90 lid. You can call it anything you want to. You know, it's not the Gulf of America or the Gulf of Canada or, you know, all the rest of the stuff that's been floating around out of the insanity east of here. But I would suggest you go up there and look at Seattle's lid, the I-90 lid. Granted, that was put up because they were doing I-90, and where else can you get 54 acres of land where you can build a lid unless there's a natural or unnatural emergency, and the unnatural was a freeway project. So what I'm getting at is that it's a well-used, nice, beautiful lid. It's part of the trail, Sound to Mountains Trail, and my question is inclusiveness. What have you done to include, because this is going to be a regional draw, not just Capitol Hill and downtown, and the architecture firm out of Denmark said that we did not have open space downtown. Very kind of scathing report from Gell that came out a number of years ago, if you remember that, Sally. What have you done to include all of Seattle regionally, you know, particularly minorities and others? And I think that's where you're going to find a demographic that's going to support this. The I-90 lid is excellent. Go have a look at it. Go wander around it. WashDOT did a great job. Bill Southern, who was there, the late Bill Southern. Yeah, Bill was a good friend. He saved a lot of things, including getting rid of the ramp that they wanted to put there. That's another story. But I would suggest you go up and have a look at that. It is Seattle's successful lid with all its open fields. You already have density around there. We didn't have density, but now we're getting a lot of density because of the I-90 light rail station. And we're really happy to have that, because you have to have open fields. You have to have open areas. Again, Gell Architects, they have their little thing. But what have you done for diversity and at all? Or are you planning on doing an outreach to not just the neighborhoods around there, but to all of Seattle and regionally? So that's my question.
I can tackle that one, at least on one level, and that is when we did start doing our preliminary work, gosh, about 5 years ago, looking at the actual feasibility of the corridor, we did extensive outreach, and to your question, Paul, really trying to proactively engage all communities adjacent to the corridor. I think the challenge there is you have to be thoughtful about what kind of questions you asked, because often people's time is very valuable, and their opinion, they want to see the questions relevant to what's going to happen in the next few years, and it's important that you not waste their time getting input that isn't germane to the input that you need at that time. So just doing outreach for outreach's sake, I think, is a mistake. Really making sure that you're engaging people at an appropriate time when their opinions can be folded in to the bigger design. And I don't have an answer exactly on how to do that, but it is a bit of a cautionary tale that simply connecting with people, understanding their needs, isn't necessarily sufficient if you're not able to then quickly turn that input into a tangible result.
Do you have another question? Excellent.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the insightful comments. Downtown Seattle doesn't have a lot of green space, as Paul referenced, nor does Lower First Hill or Capitol Hill. And when I look at the design concepts, I have to say I'm a little disappointed that there's not more focus on connection with nature. And so my question for you is, how much of that, in your opinion, is driven by good design choices around activation, and how much of that is a political decision around building a coalition to get this across the finish line?
We should bring up folks from the Lit I-5 team but to answer that question. But I would say that just from my knowledge, and John, you can certainly add on here, it's early days. I think we have looked at some just preliminary concepts, and we did explore a number of solutions. Kind of Goldilocks, a complete open space park on one end to complete private development on the other, just to see the implications and how that would affect the cost, how that would affect the structural elements. But that was just preliminary analysis, and I can be corrected, but I don't think there's been any determination on what's the right mix there. And certainly we understand the lack of green space and open space in our downtown.
As a master gardener, I just want to say the more trees, the better, so I'm with you.
Yeah, no, I think you're essentially right, Lyle. All the images you see are really just throwing spaghetti on the wall. It was done by volunteers, meaning, after hours and after work, and we gave them very loose parameters. The southern part was open space, the middle part was what we call commerce, and the north part was housing. There is no design. There is nothing that's written down. It's much too early in the process. And the next phase we're going to be doing is the urban design vision, where people such as yourselves, and hopefully people in this room, start to state, these are the things we really need to go on here. Not necessarily this needs to go in this exact space, but we want more open space. We want more whatever. We want more streets. I don't want to necessarily assume what people are going to have. But again, the images you see were really just to create the kind of pictures that Sally was referencing, just to get people excited. No decisions have been made, and they're hardly quantitative. But when you're dealing with a lot of volunteers and volunteers' hours, you kind of have to let them run the way they want to go.
Just a quick follow-up question then. What is the right mix between, you mentioned activation and obviously having more people in the areas, more activating, more housing, but also, there's already a lot of density around the space.
I think it's a brilliant question. I think that's going to be our burning question as we move forward to the next piece and kind of the next level here. One cautionary tale, and that is if you have a just giant lid, unless you're very specific about how you fill it up, it tends to just get filled up with other stuff. And so being deliberative, useful stuff like more streets and that kind of thing, but then you lose the kind of key objectives that you might be looking for. So really being clear in terms of what does this thing need to accomplish so that you don't miss opportunities as you build these things.
Thank you.
I did want to, just add one clarification point to pick up on what Song had said earlier, is we use the Central Waterfront as kind of the gold standard and guide star for what we're doing. So we're very intent on creating the kind of stewardship or stakeholders group, or we don't even know what to call it yet, that will be comprised of people at the neighborhood level, First Hill, Capitol Hill, the more regional advocates such as the Downtown Seattle Association, affordable housing advocates, and even larger entities, the Mountains to Sound Greenway, who knows, but we're going to scale this up at every level. And it has the risk of being a rather unwieldy, large group of people, but it was successful on the waterfront, and we want to make sure we kind of capture from the micro to the macro in terms of interest groups.
And another interest group stepping up to the microphone, Julie.
I'm just going to chime in with the downtown neighborhood, the core downtown neighborhood. My name's Julia Biavout. I am chair of the Downtown Community Council. We focus on residents in particular, but I'm kind of speaking here as myself, which is a Third Pike Pine resident. And so love the vision, really want more green space downtown, so I'll put in a vote for more trees, more green. But I'm just kind of wondering about how, if and how you're engaging with other bold visions that are kind of underway and or that will be coming up between the LID project and the waterfront. So for instance, the Westlake Park and 3rd Avenue, which is another division we have in the city. And so is there a way to kind of like, be in conversation with these things now? I know it's still very early, but where either, you're building off of those visions or vice versa, and they're in conversation with each other.
I like a big tent and no circus. So I think you're absolutely right. You want to make sure that you've got all of your interests there. And again, that's not just a politically wise thing to do, but I think it produces a much better design.
And Julie, I just want to recognize you and the good work that you've done with this growing Downtown Community Council, because it's going to make a big difference. And I do want to suggest that the connection that you're talking about on 3rd Avenue that goes from now the Spark Blocks up at Virginia and 3rd all the way down into Pioneer Square connects with the work that Marshall Foster is doing at Seattle Center, the vision that is coming out of there, once again connecting with downtown. But you start seeing these pathways, which one connects to the center connects east-west and down to the waterfront. And this is going to blossom. And I think the enthusiasm that we're seeing here tonight is the kind of thing where everybody can bring their best ideas into the tent. I love that, Lyle. I want a big tent, but not a circus. Good. Oh, hey, Bob, come on up.
Hello, I'm Bob Edmiston, volunteer at Seattle Neighborhood Greenways, but I'm also a user experience researcher who works downtown. And that brings up the question of how do we include representative sampling for the people who will actually be using the lid? If you think 20 years in advance, the people who will be using it are 10 years old now. How do we fill this room with 10-year-olds who will be the actual users of the lid and not us who will be outside of the system by the time it's built?
Getting a room of 10-year-olds sounds pretty exciting to me. Yeah, no, it's a very good point. How do we do it? I'm going to ask John Fite to answer that one. We'll see.
I would welcome, those are the kind of voices we need in this process, right? Because at least for myself, having been involved in this for 10 years, that thought never occurred to me. And that's one of the reasons we're having these beer and cultures, right, is to flush out these ideas. And note that we're having these events before we've written any solicitation documents. In fact, OPCD, who's going to be our partner in this, we haven't really planned a schedule. We haven't even really talked about the consultants we're going to hire until we decided to engage in these series, because we need these kinds of conversations so we can think, wow, how do we engage the youth? And we'll, through this steering committee I described, we need people representing those kinds of points of view so that they can help guide the process to those kinds of answers. Because there's only a few of us working now, and it really needs to be brought into a much bigger environment.
I'd like to throw in a plug for the Seattle Youth Commission. It's one of the commissions that the city of Seattle has, and I think it's an underutilized group. There's students from all over the city. I think they have to have at least one from every district and more. But these are people that are, I think, from 8th grade up to senior in high school. And we need to make sure that those voices are included. And we've got a built-in organization, the Seattle Youth Commission.
I'm so sorry. That was a very beautiful, thoughtful answer. And I also have to answer and just say TikTok memes.
You have to do them for me. Please come on up.
Hello, so thanks so much for this. So I have sort of the opposite question, in that I'm fairly new to Seattle, and if I've learned anything, that I am not a small demographic in that sense. And so I guess my question is kind of when you compare all of this with kind of like the older projects and whatnot, and realizing that, you know, like some percentage of the population, right, is pretty new, right, may not be staying around for a while. How do you consider that when kind of building this political willpower, given that like a lot of people will be concerned about things like whether I-5 is still open, or whether, like their, sales tax is going to be a little bit higher, things of that nature?
Yeah, even though we have had an influx of, as we talked about, our population grew dramatically in the last 10 years, one thing has remained constant, and that has been the generosity of the Seattle voters, far exceeding my expectations. So, we talk about like the cost of this project being daunting. I don't think that the cost of this project is daunting. I mean, we just passed this a few days ago, a Seattle School District capital levy for $1.8 billion received 70% of the vote. So I think the good thing that we have going for us as a city is we are one of the most educated and best informed cities in the nation. When you look at our metrics about the number of people that have college degrees and all of that, very well informed. And also strong engagement. Again, I just look around this room, and if you had asked me, how many people do you think are going to show up on a Wednesday night to talk about a land use downtown project, I would not have said 140 people, okay? So, we just got to take advantage of all of those things ahead.
And if you have suggestions, and I mean this seriously, if you have suggestions on way we can meet your demographic, I'd like to know. When I was running for office, I can tell you that I would call Amazon and Google, Facebook, and say, do you have any kind of an organization of anybody there who wants to talk to candidates? And there were a few. Every time there were a few, but there might be 20, not 200. But those are the people that wanted to talk, and boy, was I willing to talk.
Hi there. I'm a Belltowner, and I've been in Seattle like almost 18 years, or almost 20 years now, 18 in Belltown. And I have to say, I started coming here on travel assignments since 1999, and I would, within 12 years, still talks. Seattle talks an awful lot, and that is really frustrating for a lot of us. But when you're looking at these projects, and I see we have people in the room, and a lot of times a lot of people are engaged in the same people. I think definitely youth and reaching out to schools within the area to get them involved in projects. Like if you could design a lid, what would it look like? I mean, that's a great way. You go into the schools and do that. But a representation, like I have PTSD and I have mobility issues. So for me, walking down to Myrtle Edwards Park, which used to be what I used to be able to do, that's not accessible to me anymore unless I drive down that, and that just takes the whole purpose of getting out there and being outside. So having a lid, that's feasible for me. Cal Allenstown Park is too far, and so that is brilliant, but I think within a space, you need nature, you need bird boxes, you need bug hotels, you need to get a lot more stuff in there and increase the canopy. But have spaces for people who have got altered mobility. So if they're in a walking boot or the crutches or wheelchair, whether it be manual propelled or electric, or you're just struggling, and you so have everything sloped and no steps, but have it so that somebody like me can go into a space and it feels more calm in a city where you have got a break, whether you're working or not. And I think it's really important that you start, when you're planning it, you bring people in there who represent those who have issues with mobility. They are blind, they have a stick, they're walking alone, or they have a guide dog with them. But I think it's really important to get everyone at the table, so true representation of your community is solved. And I wondered if that happens normally, or you just hope that people come in there who are a little bit more diverse and represent us a lot better.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. The notion of all ages and abilities is something very near and dear to my heart, and I'm with you. All right, looks like we have ended the queue. If there's nothing else, thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks for your enthusiasm and engagement. I think that's it.